Hello, welcome everybody. Glad to see you all out here. Welcome to our audience here at UBC Robson Square. Welcome to our audience watching on the live stream as well. My name is Michelle Eliot. I'm a journalist with CBC Radio, and I host CBC's noontime open line show, BC Today. And I will be your host and moderator this evening. Before we get started, I would like to acknowledge that we are on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Musqueam, the Squamish, and the Tsleil-Waututh peoples. I'm thrilled to see so many of you here tonight. I overheard someone saying this was their second event on electoral reform and that they hope they would understand it finally by the end of the night. So fingers crossed, we're here to help you. If you are a registered voter, you should have received your ballot, or you will be receiving your ballot by November 2nd. And as you know, British Columbians are being asked whether they would like to keep the province's current first-past-the-post system or switch to one of three systems of electoral reform. There is a lot to consider, and tonight we are lucky to have four experts here on stage to help us understand those different systems and their implications for parties, for politics, and for people here in BC. Each of our panelists will have a short presentation to share, after which we will have the better part of an hour to ask questions. And we will have a couple of ways to do that. We will be using Slido tonight to collect questions online and allow you to express your opinions as well on live polls. This is the first time I'm hearing of Slido, so we'll figure it out together. You can take out your phones, go to slido.com. That's SLIDO.com. Type in the event code, which is #ERForumUBC. That's ERForumUBC. And you can use Slido throughout the evening to submit a question to the panelists, to see what others are asking. You can also upvote questions that you like. I'm told this is like hitting like on Facebook, and that will move that question up on the list. So during the Q&A, we'll project the questions up on the screen behind me, and you can follow along. And we ask that you do address your question to a specific panelist. We will then allow others to weigh in after that first person has answered your question. Now, if you don't have a smartphone, we are also doing things the old-fashioned way. There is a runner who will be going up and down with cue cards and pens, so you can write down your questions. Just give them a wave, and you can submit your question on paper, and we'll use it then. Now, as I said, we are also using Slido tonight to poll the audience on a few key questions. So the first poll is up now. It's live. It's asking you how you're feeling about the referendum so far. Have you made up your mind? So log in to Slido to weigh in, and we will put up the results on the projector after the presentations. Now, I know some people are tweeting as well tonight, so we would love for you to join in on the conversation on Twitter as well. You can use the hashtag, once again, #ERForumUBC. And before we turn it over to our panelists, I would like to invite Andrew Seri to the stage. As Provost and Vice President Academic for UBC Vancouver, Andrew Seri provides leadership for the university's academic strategy, budgetary, and planning processes. He's also a professor in mechanical engineering at UBC, and prior to his appointment at UBC, Andrew served in successive academic leadership roles and was a professor of mechanical engineering at the University of California, Berkeley. He has won several research awards, 4 teaching awards, and a recent award for excellence in student mentoring. Andrew Seri, welcome to the podium.
Thank you, Michelle, for the warm welcome, and good evening, everyone. It's a real pleasure to be here and to see an almost packed house. That's really excellent. As you may have read, UBC's new strategic plan commits us to trying to lead as a model public institution, fostering discourse, knowledge exchange, and engagement. This includes making academic knowledge more accessible, understandable, and relevant so that it can inform public policy and civic discourse. Tonight, you will hear from 4 distinguished thinkers in the field of political science, including Max Cameron, who is director of UBC's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, Richard Johnston, the Canada Research Chair on Public Opinion, Elections, and Representation, Sheryl Lightfoot, Canada Research Chair in Global Indigenous Rights and Politics, and Grace Lohr, a UBC PhD graduate and now at UVic with an in-depth knowledge of electoral systems and women's political representation. Max, Richard, Sheryl, Grace, thank you for being here with us tonight and for the work you do engaging the public on this and other topics of democratic importance. British Columbians are facing a big decision in this coming month, whether to keep the province's first-past-the-post system or to change to one of three options for proportional representation. In the midst of a political campaign, it's easy to get lost in the jargon and the rhetoric. Our panelists are here to help. We hope you will leave this evening feeling more informed and less confused, if that's the case, about the choice that is before you and all British Columbians. I invite you to think of yourselves tonight not as an audience, but rather as participants. You're here to ask questions and to animate a space for dialogue and active learning. We're lucky to have a very talented moderator tonight to help usher such a conversation forward. Michelle, it's an honor for me to share the stage with such an accomplished alumna from UBC. You'll, of course, recognize Michelle Eliot's voice from CBC Radio's midday call-in show, BC Today. She's also appeared on a number of regional and national programs. Michelle studied English literature at UBC and went on to study broadcast journalism at BCIT before joining CBC Vancouver in the year 2000. Thank you for being here with us tonight, Michelle. We're in good hands with you as our host. Back to you to get us started.
Thank you, Andrew. I have many fond memories of my time at UBC and at CITR. Thank you for mentioning that. Now, as Andrew said, we have 4 political scientists seated here on stage with me tonight. I've interviewed most of them, and they are excellent presenters on this topic. They've each prepared a short presentation to share with you, and that should take us to about 8 o'clock. And then we will turn the evening over to you and your questions. And I would like now to invite our first panelist up to the podium. Max Cameron is director of UBC's Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions and a professor of political science at UBC. He's a familiar face in public debates, lectures, and the media around a variety of democratic reform initiatives and has contributed to submissions to the Electoral Reform Committee of the House of Commons in 2016 and the Office of the Attorney General in 2018. Cameron is the co-founder and organizer of an annual Summer Institute for Future Legislators, which is a program designed for people who want to enter public office. And Max, welcome to the podium.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, for that introduction. And thanks to the UBC Office for Community Engagement for convening us, and particularly Julie for all the work that she did in making this happen. But more than that, thanks to all of you for showing up tonight for this conversation. I think this is a great opportunity for us to have a conversation about the democracy we live in, what we like about it, what kinds of things we might like to do to change it or to improve it. And what electoral reform might mean for us. And so what I would like to do today is to talk about the choice that we have. We've been given an opportunity here in BC to choose whether we want to stick with the current first-past-the-post voting system or adopt a new system of proportional representation. If we do decide that we want to adopt the system of proportional representation, there are 3 different options on the ballot that we can choose from. I'd like to begin by explaining the difference between first-past-the-post and proportional representation. And I'm going to argue that these different voting systems really reflect different underlying visions of what democracy is about. And then I'm going to go through each of the proposed proportional representation systems that are on the ballot, and I'm going to argue that each one of them is, in some sense, an attempt to compromise or to find a balance between first-past-the-post and some kind of proportional representation. This is the ballot that many of you, I suspect, have already received. I got mine yesterday. Very excited to fill it out and send it in. I was so excited to get the ballot. I'm actually sure I want to fill it out. I just want to frame it and put it up on my wall. But I'm going to exercise my democratic right to have a say in the kind of electoral system we have. I hope all of you will do that too. And as you can see from this ballot, it gives us two choices, right? It's going to ask us, first of all, the question of principle. Do we want to keep our current system, or do we want to move to something more proportional? That question is independent then from the three systems that we get to choose from. And so it's important to state at the outset that even if you don't want proportional representation, if you decide you want to keep the current system, you can still mark your ballot on the second question and indicate which of those proportional representations you would prefer if you had to move to a PR system. By the same token, you may very well like the idea of proportional representation, but be entirely unsure of what kind of system you prefer, or not be sure of how to rank them. You can put one mark if you wish, you can mark all three, or you don't have to mark it at all. That's entirely up to you. So these two questions are quite independent, and that's done really quite deliberately. This ballot is very similar to the kind of ballot that the New Zealanders had when they shifted from first past the post to, in their case, mixed member proportional back in 1996. So let's take a look, first of all, at the ballot that we currently have. When you go to vote, you walk into the polling station in our current system, you typically see a ballot that looks something like this. You have a list of candidates associated with different parties. You may have independents as well. And you mark an X beside the candidate that you most prefer. Now, this is a system in which the candidate who wins the largest number of votes carries the seat. So it's called a plurality system. You don't have to get an absolute majority over 50%. You simply have to be the candidate who got the most votes. And what that does mean is that the votes that did not go to the winning candidate do not count toward the representation of those other parties. That's why it's called a winner-take-all system. And it has the admirable virtue of simplicity, but it has the disadvantage that simplicity comes with a price. And the price is that it's entirely possible to have a majority that's constructed on the basis of pluralities of the vote, so that a party can win many pluralities across the jurisdiction, not necessarily getting 50% of the vote, but actually taking more than 50% of the seats. Those are sometimes referred to as false majority governments. I think that the people who like this system, and I've spent a lot of time talking to people over the last few weeks and months about the systems, do people want change or not? And one of the things that I find is that when you talk with people who like our current system, they will often say, I like the fact that we get decisive elections, elections who decide who are the winners and losers. Governments are formed, they have a mandate to govern. Typically, these are single-party majority governments. They rule for a period of time, and at the end of it, if we don't like what they have done, we can throw the bums out, or if we like what they've done, we can keep them. So there's a kind of a sense that this is a system that's built around mandates and accountability. Now, PR systems are based, I think, on a quite different understanding of what democracy is. The basic notion is, of course, that there ought to be a rough correspondence between the percentage of the vote that each party gets in the electorate and the share of the seats that they win in the legislature. This appeals to, I think, a sense of fairness among the electorate. The cost is that to get proportionality, you typically need somewhat larger districts and sometimes fairly complicated formulas for translating votes into seats. The people who like this kind of system like it because of its fairness. Votes are not wasted. Even if you didn't vote for the winning candidate in your district, your vote still counts toward getting representation for the party that you most support. Representation is better. There's a better representation of diverse viewpoints. And there is a kind of an expectation that parties will work together to form government. And that reinforces or creates an incentive for parties to compromise and find common ground. The consequence of that is you don't get what first past the post advocates will often call stable majority single-party governments, but you do tend to get greater stability around policy because of the imperative to find consensus, which I think tends to push parties a bit more to the center. Now, how do the three systems that are on the ballot here in BC attempt to achieve proportionality? They do it in different ways. Each one of them, I will argue, combines some element of first past the post with proportional representation. They appear on the ballot in alphabetical order, but coincidentally, it so happens that each of these systems, as we go from the top to the bottom, we go from systems that are most like our current first past the post system to those that are most different from it. So the first one that's on the ballot is dual member proportional. So let me just quickly go through dual member proportional. Under this system, districts are combined into, neighboring districts are coupled together. They're combined into a slightly large, or double, twice as large riding, which is now to be represented by 2 MLAs, not just one. So you have the same proportion of voters to representatives in larger ridings. Rural ridings would probably be largely left alone. So very, very geographically large ridings would be left alone. Parties then have the option of running 1 or 2 candidates on the ballot, a primary candidate and a secondary candidate. Again, like in first past the post, voters mark an X beside the ballot that they, beside the candidates and party that they prefer to indicate their preference. And after all the votes are counted, the primary candidate in the party with the largest number of votes carries the first seat, just like in first past the post. So the primary candidates that are elected on the basis of plurality. The second seats go to parties according to proportional representation. That is, we look at the number of seats that the party has earned based on the votes that it has received province-wide. And if the number of seats that it should have based on proportional representation is higher than the number of seats that they won in the plurality contest for the first candidate, then they are topped up by additional seats chosen from those ridings where that party performed the best. The second system that we have is called mixed member proportional. In this system, we're going to have 2 different types of MLAs. There are going to be MLAs that are elected in districts. So again, if you look at that ballot, what you can see is a district vote. In this case, you have 2 votes. A district vote, and that looks very much like the first past the post ballot. That's the first past the post component. The second are candidates who are allocated on the basis of regional votes. So a number of ridings are combined together to produce new regions, and parties present lists in those regions. Each region would have several MLAs, and they are selected in order to ensure that the seats are allocated according to proportionality. The final system is rural-urban proportional. Now, this system retains mixed member proportional in the rural areas, so it's like the last system in rural areas, but in the cities, we would introduce a system known as the single transferable vote. Now, single transferable vote districts are larger and represented by a number of different MLAs. So these are multi-member ridings, typically between 2 and 7. Voters are allowed to rank their preferred candidates on the ballot, and each party has more than one candidate, can have more than one candidate on the ballot. Typically what happens is there are several rounds of counting of the ballots. A quota is established, which is based on the number of voters and the number of seats that are available in that riding. And the candidate whose first preferences crosses that threshold and has met that quota earns that seat. Excess votes, additional votes beyond what's required to carry that seat, are then transferred or distributed to other candidates according to the second preferences of the voters. And that process continues on an iterative basis until all of the seats are filled. This can also require that smaller candidates who do not win enough votes may be knocked off the ballot and their seats also redistributed. So as you can see, we really have a number of interesting choices on the ballot. And I think it's important as we face this choice, remember that each of these systems is an attempt to find a compromise between first past the post on the one hand and proportional representation. There are no pure proportional representation systems on the ballot. Each of these is a mix. It's an effort to find a balance that would work for our specific jurisdiction. Hopefully, I realize that this is complicated stuff. We do hope that this presentation and the others that follow, those that follow, will at least raise you to a higher level of confusion, and that as you leave today, you will be feeling in a better position to cast your ballot. And above all, I do hope you go out and vote. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Max. Our next panelist is Richard Johnston. He's a professor in political science at UBC and Canada Research Chair in Public Opinions, Elections, and Representation. He has also taught at Toronto, Caltech, Harvard, and the University of Pennsylvania. Richard is a specialist on elections, party systems, and electoral systems, with a special emphasis on Canada, the United States, and Germany. Richard Johnston, welcome to the podium.
Thank you. So I'm going to try and give you some sense of the implications for representation and governance of the alternatives that Max outlined, although mostly I will be talking about the big question of proportional representation versus the first past the post status quo. So let's get right into it. First of all, one thing you have to do is you have to unpack some of the things that Max has just talked about. We tend to talk about electoral systems as if they're these kind of unbreakable bundles of things, but they actually require us to combine a bunch of things. You have to make a decision about how many members there are for a given district. We're accustomed to having single-member districts, but in fact a district could have any number of members. Israel and the Netherlands have one district called Israel and the Netherlands, so they have an enormous district magnitude. Mixed member proportional, in fact, any of these systems that we're talking about here has a kind of mixed notion of what the magnitude is. There is a single member part, but then there's a province-wide or regional part, and exactly how big those regional bits are quite consequential to the results, as a matter of fact, because the general proposition is if you're going for proportionality, bigger district magnitudes are better from the point of view of achieving proportionality, okay? We have to talk about what kind of ballot we have. We have under first past the post a categorical ballot. You just put an X in the box and that takes care of it. But the STV component of rural-urban is a preferential ballot, so there's that. One of the most consequential choices in this business, if you opt for proportional representation, is whether the list of candidates is open or closed, whether you get to make a direct choice of the candidate that you wish to represent the party in question, or whether the party gets to compose the list in a particular way. And that's very consequential, in particular for descriptive representation, especially for women. I mean, Grace will have a lot more to say about this, but I'll say a couple of top-line things about the descriptive representation of women as affected by the character of the list. And then the formula. So we're talking about here, a status quo is the plurality. Let me see if I can make this guy work here. Status quo is the plurality. The proportional, some kind of proportional formula, there are many, is the alternative on the ballot. There's a few things to say about the majority formula, which is in spirit much like the plurality, but has a different way of achieving its majorities. And then for everything, we need to have a notion of threshold. The system we have right now has a threshold. It's hard to get into Parliament with small shares of the vote. There isn't an explicit threshold. It's a kind of moving and contingent one, but there is one in the current system. And there's much talk about making specific and decided thresholds as part of the PR alternatives on the ballot. So just try to keep those things in mind. I'll come back to them at various points. So one of the claims for proportional representation is that turnout is higher under it, and that's just generally true. So you'll see pictures like this over the next few minutes. So what I've done here is I've basically taken data from kind of the rich consolidated capitalist democracies, the longer-standing members of the European Union, and the members of the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, places that have been at this business long enough that you can actually use them to found some generalizations. And so up here, each dot is an election outcome for a given country in a given year, and then what I've got is these smooth lines, blue for first past the post, red for PR, and then the dots correspond. So that's what you're going to see. And yes, in general, turnout is higher amongst PR systems. Turnout has dropped everywhere, although the drop has been somewhat steeper under first past the post. The one possible argument here is that people turn out at higher rates under PR because they don't see their votes as likely to be wasted or as likely to be unevenly weighted as under first past the post. Think of it, for a notion of weight, think of this. I live in Vancouver, Kulchena. It's the most one-sidedly liberal riding in the province. When I dutifully go to the polls, I do so because I have visions of my mother looking down at me. I'm a political scientist. It would be a little embarrassing not to, but in some sense, at some pretty fundamental level, I'm doing it because I have a taste for it. I am acutely conscious of the fact it does not matter whether I do this or not. And Andrew Wilkinson doesn't need my vote, and all the alternatives can't use my vote. So that on the other hand, if I lived in Surrey and I had Uber on the brain, and well, guess what? The last provincial election was decided basically in Surrey. If you looked at the campaign strategy of the NDP, and actually to a certain extent the Greens, but especially the NDP, you can see that they basically wrote most of the province off and focused on that set of ridings that were closely contested, right? The ones that decided the result. The weight of a vote in those ridings was greater than in Vancouver-Kulchena, and so some people argue that people kind of incorporate that into their reasoning and don't feel, or less likely to feel as discouraged about voting as under first past the post. Could be. It could also be, however, that it's other background characteristics. Proportional representation countries tend to be smaller. They tend to be more densely populated. It's possible that what we're really talking about is sort of sociological circumstances that make it easier for people to vote. And another point, which I'll actually conclude with, but I'll anticipate here, parties of the left tend to do better under PR, and PR tends to exist in countries that have stronger union movements. These are important mobilizers of the vote, and so that could be the story as well. So I don't think you should expect that should we go over to PR, all of a sudden we'll have a 10-point bump in turnout. We may, but it's too soon to tell. One of the claims on behalf of proportional representation is that women are more likely to sit in parliament, and it's true. Here's the trends. I mean, what you're seeing here in some sense, we're talking about a social movement, right? That there's a movement out there. But the movement is much more readily channeled, if you will, under PR than under first past the post. And the gap is actually slowly widening. Question is, what's the mechanism? Why would a formula make a difference? Well, the answer doesn't really. The answer is that having proportional representation opens up certain possibilities for listing members, right? So if you look at the, pardon me, here's where we sit on average across this post-1960 period. I've also included Australia and France in here. They're single-member district systems, but they're not plurality systems, but they're single-member district systems. And here we have proportional representation systems with an open list, a thoroughly open list. For example, it's not the only kind, but an open list would be one where you have a set of candidate names associated with the party, and you just choose the candidate you like. The party's entitlement to seats will reflect the cumulative vote across all its candidates, but which candidates happen to sit will be the product of the choices of individual persons. Well, in that kind of system, you have barely any gain over the status quo. The gains come from having some kind of party list system, and the key thing seems to be that you let the party, as it were, go first. The party gets to propose an order. You may be entitled to disturb it if you wish, but the record seems to be that parties still get to get a lot of their list, as they prefer it, elected. And it's listing, it's the opportunity for a party to, pardon me, to order its preferences in such a way as to, if not guarantee, at least greatly enable the representation of categoric groups. Okay, I better move along here. Disproportionality, this is the key knock on the current system, that votes as they are translated into seats are much more likely to have the distribution distorted under first past the post, under PR. Here's the various things that can go into this. So there is an amplification of differences amongst parties as votes are translated. It usually leaves the rank order more or less intact, at least towards the top. You do occasionally get plurality reversals, where a party with less than a province-wide plurality forms the government. It does happen. It's very occasional, though. And you get a chronic difference between regionally concentrated and geographically dispersed parties. For small parties, concentration is good. The Greens may be underrepresented at 3 seats in the House, but they wouldn't have any of those seats if they weren't the party of Southern Vancouver Island. Okay? PR, there's inevitably some disproportionately under PR. A large part of it is rounding error. I'm struggling here. A large part of it is rounding error because the question is trying to take a kind of a continuous 0 to 100 percentage distribution and squeeze it into 4, 5, 6 seats. You're going to have rounding error, and the district magnitude, this is where district magnitude really starts to matter, because the smaller the magnitude, the more error. And then there's this question of threshold. So, I mean, the threshold leads to a lot of underrepresentation. Moving sort of towards the formation of governments, it is generally true that you have more parties under PR than under first past the post. What I have here is a kind of notion called effective number of parties. It's kind of a size-weighted number of parties. And by, oops, wrong. And by that measurement, you get in the order of, on average, sort of 2 or so more effectively equivalent parties under PR than under first past the post. Both first past the post and PR reduce that number of parties as you translate votes into seats. Under PR, a lot of that is being done by the threshold, but some of it's being done by, as it were, rounding error. Although PR actually has about the same effect in reducing the number of parties, the fact is you're still going to have in the order of 4 or so parties in a PR parliament for every 2 that you'd have in a first past the post. There's some extreme cases up here. Those tend to be PR systems with large district magnitudes. Okay? And so if you're worried about extreme fractionalization, district magnitude, reducing it is one of the ways to address that. The threshold is the other way. 2 more slides, I think. So what are the odds of a single-party majority? Overwhelming under first past the post, extremely unlikely under PR. The modal kind of party under PR is a majority coalition. The next most common is a minority, which could also be a coalition. So you would not have a life ordinarily organized by single-party majorities under PR. That's just not the way life is. I will pass over that and end here. Frankly, as far as I'm concerned, this is what it's really about. You can talk discursive this and that, but it is a struggle for power, and the implication is what's the profile of the state vis-a-vis taxation, regulation, social insurance, redistribution. Parties of the left do better under proportional representation than under first past the post. They just do. Doing better here means a duration-weighted share of cabinet portfolios. So in 2018, assuming that the government survives the year, that share for the NDP will be 100, all of the portfolios for the entirety of the year. Their share for 2017 would be about 50.5 because they governed for half the year. In most partly PR systems where governments are coalitions, what we're talking about is the share of cabinet portfolios in a multi-party government weighted for the duration of that government. Okay, so it's like that. It's participating in government. It doesn't mean necessarily controlling it. And to come back to this point here, in terms of participation in government, in terms of, if you think of portfolio years in some sense as the measure of the weight of the party in the policy-making system, here's the typical weight under PR for a party of the left. Here's the typical weight under first past the post. And this is kind of the BC story. 1 in 5, 1 in 4, 1 in 6, something like that. I won't dwell on this because this is mostly about Christian democratic parties and Scandinavian-style farmers' parties. Here's the other side. Here's why the Liberal Party is resisting the change. Here's why the NDP is pushing the change, and the Greens. And let's be clear about this. This is, in some sense, the biggest stake, and the choice amongst the three alternatives doesn't affect this very much, I would say. And so you want to have this in mind. Now, I would say it's easy to characterize this then as a cynical sort of thing. The NDP just wants to guarantee itself a path to power. And it certainly wants to improve its likelihoods of having a path to power. But I'd also suggest that you look from here to here and from here to here. So if we're talking what's the probability or what's the kind of share of cabinet portfolios that parties of the left will have, what's the share of cabinet portfolios that party of the right will have, there's a difference averaged across all these places, but it's quite small. And there's some sense in which what you're talking about is access to government that is broadly proportional to the party's base in the electorate at large, as compared with a very different kind of game being played under the current system. And at that, I will leave it.
Hi there. Oh, there we are. I do like that idea of using parental guilt to get more people to vote. I'm going to start using that with my kids. I can't wait. We're going to turn things over now to Sheryl Lightfoot. She is the Canada Research Chair of Global Indigenous Rights and Politics at UBC, where she holds academic appointments in both political science and First Nations and Indigenous studies. She's also currently serving as Senior Advisor to the UBC President on Indigenous Affairs. Her research focuses on Indigenous politics, especially Indigenous rights and their implementation in global, national, and regional contexts. Dr. Lightfoot is Anishinaabe from the Lake Superior Band of Ojibwe. Sheryl Lightfoot, welcome.
There we are. Okay, thank you for the welcome, and thanks to all the organizers, and Max and Richard and Grace, my fellow panelists. It is my pleasure to be here and discuss one of the representation issues associated with the PR first past the post system. And as Max so kindly set the stage for me, New Zealand, or its official name is Aotearoa New Zealand, moved from a first past the post system to MMP system in, well, the first election was in 1996. And at that point, the MMP became affectionately known as More Maori in Parliament. And so Max has talked about that. And I want to present a bit of the history and the context for comparison's sake between us here in BC and the Maori experience in New Zealand, because what I see is it isn't quite that simple, although that is a truth. And what we have seen is definitely a shift in Maori representation in New Zealand, but how that shift has come about, I think, has actually been quite a bit more dynamic and more unpredictable than one might think at first blush. So just to give you a little bit of context, assuming you're not all familiar with New Zealand politics, I've been an avid watcher for about 20 years, but I don't assume that anyone else is. So let me just give you a little bit of background. And let's just start from the idea that even though we constantly make comparisons between Canada and New Zealand for some very obvious reasons, and particularly British Columbia and New Zealand for some very obvious reasons, they are actually very different contexts. And so I want to draw out just a couple key points that we need to keep in mind when we're talking about these two cases. New Zealand has a single treaty between settlers and the Maori, and it dates back to 1840. And there's a significant controversy there over what the cessions of sovereignty actually were, and that's not a question we're going to get into tonight because the treaty context in BC is entirely different. We have a little bit of the numbered treaties, we have some Douglas treaties, and for the most part, BC is non-treaty territory. So the way that plays out in terms of Indigenous politics and whether Indigenous peoples choose to engage in the electoral system or stay outside of it and preserve their Aboriginal rights and title is a completely different conversation that we're just going to bracket and hold off for now. So I'm just going to talk about those who choose to participate in the Canadian electoral system. And what we have seen in comparing it with New Zealand is Maori people there, generally speaking, have engaged in electoral politics in New Zealand much more extensively and at a much earlier date than we have seen in Canada. So just important context things to keep in mind. And a couple other huge historical differences. In 1867, we had the Maori Representation Act, which guaranteed at that time a set of Maori seats, guaranteed Maori seats in the Parliament. What that means is, from 1867, there have been two electorates in New Zealand that have been operational, the general electorate and the Maori electorate. And Maori could only vote in one or the other. And actually, at the time, in the 19th century, they could only vote in the Maori electorate. As things have moved forward, Maori have been able to choose, once we got to the end of the 20th century, between whether they could vote on the general roll or the Maori roll. And they get an opportunity to make that choice about once every 10 years or when the census is done. Now, the logic for the Maori seats, and I've heard this raised a little bit in current political conversation and discourse. It's important to keep in mind that the Maori seats were actually designed in the 19th century mode of thinking. So they were designed to actually underrepresent Maori people in the electorate and to keep that power constrained and keep it down. And so at the time that these were established, there should have been, by population proportion, 14 to 16 Maori seats if we were talking about proper comparisons to population, but they were given 4. So you can see that's a significant structural underrepresentation. Because it was the 19th century, they were viewed as temporary, they were intended to be a pathway to assimilation into the society, and of course, like I said, keep Maori political power tightly constrained. So they're problematic at kind of a core level. Fast forward 100 years, and New Zealand had a royal commission on the electoral system, which one of its goals, stated goals, was to increase the proportion of Maori representation. And they recommended, first and foremost, that the Maori roll be completely abolished, that those guaranteed seats be done away with, and that Maori would have better representation under a PR system. And the way that they thought that could happen was to eliminate the 4% threshold for Maori parties. And under this mixed member proportional system, the Royal Commission thought that would increase Maori representation in Parliament. But surprise, surprise, the Maori did not go for this idea. They had actually become quite attached to the Maori seats and thought that that was a guaranteed pathway to representation. And so there was this huge backlash among Maori voters that said, no, we want our seats, and we still want MMP, so let's talk. And eventually out of it came a political deal that was struck whereby the Maori roll was retained and the 4% threshold rule. So any Maori party coming up had to meet the 4% rule just like any other. But a big deal happened as well in that now the number of Maori seats could float upward or downward based on the number of Maori who opted for that role. So consequently, the number of seats for the Maori roll grew almost instantly from 4 to 7, where it has pretty much stayed. Now the impacts of MMP for Maori, and remember, more Maori in Parliament. And a very prominent Maori studies professor by the name of Mason Dury said, the post-MMP period is the dawning of Maori political might. And he was not wrong. So let me show you what happened initially. It's a little bit hard to read the numbers, but here's the first election under MMP in 1996, where 13 Maori were elected into Parliament of 120 total. The Maori population percentage is about 15%, 17%, depending on who's counting and for what purposes. So under this election was the first time that the Maori representation in Parliament more or less equaled their population proportions. And you can see where it has gone over time. Sorry? Oh, that number is 29. So in the 2017 election, that's 29 MPs out of 120. Now, we've also had, in recent years, the MMP system also made possible the appearance of the Maori Party. And this is an election poster from 2008. And this party was formed in 2004 when a number of Maori MPs resigned from the Labour Party in protest over a particular policy that Labour had put forward called the Foreshore and Seabed Act. And these Maori defectors ran as a new party beginning in 2004 and 5. By the 2008 election, Maori Party actually held the balance of power in New Zealand because it won all 7 of the Maori seats, and neither National nor Labour could form a government without them. So the entire balance of power, 2008, landed with this one small party with 7 seats. But nothing is stable, and over time, politics change and people get unhappy with some of the coalitions because, strangely enough, the Maori Party, made up of 7 Maori MPs, joined with the National Party, which is the center-right party, to form a government because they were angry with Labour over the Foreshore and Seabed Act. Well, that was an uncomfortable coalition, and over time it started falling apart. So fast forward to 2017, what we saw was lots of tension that had developed between the National Party and the Maori Party. We had some more defectors who were unhappy with that coalition over time. And what happened in the 2017 election with all of these divisions and so on is that the final 2 columns show us that Maori Party and its offshoot, the Mana Movement, actually won 0 seats in the 2017 election. So Labour's back in power. National is the second party. Maori Party and Mana Party have disappeared from Parliament. That's the bad news. The good news is that in each and every one of these parties are significant Maori MPs from the entirety of the political spectrum. Everything from the Greens and Labour to New Zealand First, which is kind of an anti-immigrant type of party. There are Maori there as well. And so we've seen a broadening out of representation and kind of an ebb and flow of Maori parties. So what can we say in the final analysis? I think it's quite clear that MMP has done a couple things that were unexpected. It actually strengthened the Maori electorate, the Maori role, which was completely outside what anyone, including the Royal Commission, had expected. We have seen a clear increase in Maori MPs, increasing to an even greater proportion than their population, so as high as 24%. The birth, and we'll call it at least the temporary parliamentary death of the Maori Party. We'll see come next election what happens with that, because that's just a dynamic story that we'll keep on watching. But we've also seen prominent Maori in each and every single political party across New Zealand, from left to right, and Maori in prominent cabinet posts in all governments. So it's a mixed story, and it's one to keep watching, and I think it gives us something to all chew on and think about as we look forward to this decision. Thank you.
Thank you, Sheryl. That was fascinating. Our final presenter is Grace Lohr. She's a lecturer at the University of Victoria and a senior researcher with Equal Voice, and that's an organization dedicated to electing more women to all levels of government across Canada. Grace has a PhD in political science from UBC, where she studied the relationship between electoral systems, women's political representation, and the representation of gendered policy issues. As part of that work, she interviewed more than 80 elected women in 6 countries. Grace was also a candidate for Victoria City Council in the 2018 municipal election. And Grace Lohr, welcome to the podium.
Thank you so much. Thank you to the organizers and the panelists and to you for being here. We're having conversations about how to do democracy, how we want to choose our representatives. But it's important for us not to lose sight of the fact that we're doing democracy right now, too. These conversations, your voting, we're doing democracy about how we're going to do democracy. So I think these conversations that we're having about the systems available and evidence-based discussions are really important in that process. So I'm going to, in some ways, pick up where Professor Johnston started and talk some more about what electoral systems mean for women's representation, what it means to talk about women's representation, and what we may anticipate from the systems on offer. So where are we? Well, BC has 38% women in the provincial legislature. Up until recently, that was the highest in the country. We've now lost some ground to other provinces. So while it's quite a bit higher than it is federally, where just 1 in 4, slightly more than 1 in 4 of our MPs are women, we have seen a real slow progress. In the 2017 election, representation increased by just 1 percentage point, and that was actually erased when Christy Clark resigned her seat and there was a by-election. So we really didn't see change over that election. So parity, 50-50, still seems elusive in the Canadian context and in much of the world, so it remains an important question. As was already noted, there's a general consensus in the research that proportional representation systems do elect a higher proportion of women than those countries that use single-member first-past-the-post systems. Okay, this is just some rough grouping of countries in 2016 that was done by the Interparliamentary Union. But over time, and as Dick's graph showed, we do see a real difference in terms of proportional systems and first-past-the-post systems. Ooh, some formatting was lost here. Okay, that's fine. I will tell you what it says. Of the top 25 countries, 17 do use proportional representation. So this is just a list of how countries are doing in terms of women's representation. Okay, so we do see that in this list of 25, proportional representation is much more common, right? But it's important for us to have a sense of why. If we think part of the reason we might want to move to a new system, among other reasons, but part of a motivation might be to increase women's political representation and participation, we should have a sense of the dynamics that are at play. There's a few things worth considering. But one of the key factors in increasing the number of women elected is the same thing that increases proportionality, the number of representatives per district, this notion of district magnitude. How many MLAs do you have representing your district? Why? By being able to run more than one candidate, and in some cases being able to run quite a few number of candidates, parties don't have to pick the sort of single most acceptable candidate, right? parties can choose a variety of candidates. They're also not confined to rerunning one incumbent, right? And if women are underrepresented in politics, then we know that incumbents are more likely to be men. So this increases opportunities for parties to run more diverse candidates. Critically, PR systems are easier to combine with quotas. So part of the dynamic that we see behind proportional representation and women's representation is the role of quotas, right? If you only can pick one candidate, it's much harder to determine or to demand that parties run a certain number of women across the province, right? More party control over a number of candidates in a district actually increases opportunities to overlay a proportional system with quotas that are actively seeking to increase representation. The other element, of course, is the ways in which proportional systems elect more parties on the left. We know women are more likely to run with, and parties on the left are more likely to run more women. Okay, so these are some of the dynamics behind the representation of women in PR systems. But even this is an oversimplification. Okay, the relationship between electoral systems and women's representation has been simplified in the discussion. And since we're doing democracy right now, I think it's worth breaking it down. So this is a figure from some Fair Vote materials. What's observable here is that PR systems elect more women than those with first-past-the-post systems. Unfortunately, this image includes data that's 5 years old on the one hand, right? If we looked at it now, France with a single-member district, not plurality, but majority, is actually doing very well right now, right? We're also missing in this graph the fact that Germany is actually a mixed system, so a number of those women are elected under a first-past-the-post system, okay? So I really want us to do a good job of thinking about how representation happens and what we can expect from the new systems, okay? Part of that involves thinking about just what we mean by the representation of women. We can pull this concept apart as well. On the one hand, we've got descriptive representation, right? It's the extent to which representatives resemble those they represent. So in this case, we just mean the number of women elected, right? That's almost exclusively what I've been talking about so far. But we might also want to think about what we call substantive representation. The extent to which the activity of representatives, what they do and say, is in the interest of those they're representing, okay? So we might think about the prioritization of particularly gendered issues or the gendered lens on policy issues. And while these things are related, they're not the same thing, okay? Women in politics are more likely to raise gendered issues or come from a gendered perspective, but that, like the number of women elected, depends a lot on the electoral system. So here is a bit of the nuance that we need to bring into the discussion. On the one hand, descriptive representation, the number of women elected, increases with larger district magnitudes, with quotas that are easier to overlay on top of proportional systems, and with closed lists. Why closed lists? Well, if parties are willing and interested in increasing the number of women elected, they can make sure that their lists reflect the diversity of the province. Okay? To some extent, we're relying on parties to do that, right? But one thing we see is that with lists, you can actually see who parties are running. It's more visible. We can get some public accountability for who are running. This is not to say that women aren't able to pull in those votes for them personally, right, when we have more open lists, but we know the gendered context, right, of the gendered wage gap, gendered political networks, access to financial and other political resources mean that running independently or running for your own personal votes has a gender dynamic to it that makes election under those systems more difficult for women. Here's the flip side. Substantive representation, the amount women do to speak to raise, to prioritize gendered issues actually increases when those lists are open. Part of what they do with some of that freedom from their party, part of what they do in an effort to pull in those individualized votes in open list systems is speak to gendered issues or to issues from a gendered lens. Similarly, multiple votes for voters. So if you get to go in and rank your candidates, choose your favorites, right? And that actually impacts who's elected. While it has the impact of reducing the number of women elected, those women tend to do in politics, once they're elected, more to raise the profile of issues that have significant gendered impacts. So to some extent, we see a push and pull here in terms of what we mean by women's representation, what it is we want from our system, okay? So we can keep these things in mind in determining what kind of system we anticipate meeting our needs. Okay. So, what do we expect from the systems on offer? Dual member proportional? This system is absolutely compatible with efforts to increase the number of women elected. If sufficient number of women occupy that first spot on your ballot, the first spot for their party, we will see the election of more women, and it is, I think, there's a very real possibility with the effort from parties and demand from voters, a move to parity under this system, right? At the same time, individuals will be a bit, need to navigate their party's internal system to access that first bit, access that first spot, and so may have folks doing more of their party bidding than prioritizing gendered issues if it's not on the table. Okay, so again, that push and pull. Mixed member, it depends. A good portion of the seats under this system, right, as Dr. Cameron laid out, are still elected under our current system. So we wouldn't expect much to change there. But then we have these others who are elected under a proportional system. The thing is, we don't quite know what that looks like yet. We don't quite know who you will vote for, if you vote for a candidate or a party, right? We don't know how big those regions are. So there's a real possibility to increase the number of women elected here. But in the Bavaria version of this system, actually it's made it difficult for women to get elected under MMP, okay? So there's still work to be done on this system to have a good sense of what it will mean. Rural-urban, okay? Women among candidates are likely to increase, but urban areas may or may not elect substantially more women. We don't quite know how this will work because currently there's no evidence that voters discriminate against women at the ballot box. The party signifier is so important, it overrides any sort of perception of candidates. But we might have a situation where, as I said, those gender differences in access to political resources may make it difficult for women under STV. On the other hand, we may see people distributing their votes with this in mind, okay? And again, in the rural areas, it depends the particular form of MMP, right? How people are voting. So I'll just close with what's the work left to do, okay? Because there are some questions about our systems that are up for your vote, that are unsettled, right? These decisions will be made after the fact, and they have real impacts on the prospects for women to be elected and what we can anticipate women to do once they're elected. So this is something we should all have our eye on the other side of this. If this is an issue you care about, then thinking about the particular form of that system and the details, right? Well, details. No, the details matter. They're substantial in terms of women's representation. And then I think as we're revisiting this electoral process in relation to women's representation, we should look at the nomination process. This is a huge thing, right? Way before someone's casting your ballot, you're self-selecting into politics, and then you got to get on that ballot. And there's lots that happens there that significantly impacts women's likelihood of success and even participating in the first place. This falls outside of Elections BC's hands right now, but that's not the case in every province, and we can revisit it for rules around money, predictability, et cetera. That will make a huge difference no matter what the system looks like. And then finally, We have public funding for parties as a bridge in this time when we've reduced the amount people can donate and spend. New Brunswick has just used, for the first time, a proactive policy to get more women elected. All they did was tie this public funding to parties based on the gender of the candidate that was being voted for. The per vote subsidy was higher for women than it was for men. This encouraged parties to run more women and run them where they were likely to get votes. The party's bank account depended on it. So in this period of time where we have public funding for parties, which we hadn't in the past, there's an opportunity here, if we're serious about increasing women's representation, to use this in any of the systems we choose. So again, work left to be done, and work that will continue after the election to keep our eye on this particular issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Grace, and thank you to everyone. Grace Lohr, Sheryl Lightfoot, Max Cameron, Richard Johnston. One more round of applause, please. That was great. I really appreciated the context that you've brought to the discussion. Now, we move on to the next part of our evening. Time to open up the floor to your questions. And if you've figured out how Slido works, I'd love to know how it does work, so you can help me out. As a reminder, to ask a question, just get out your smartphones, log in to slido.com, and enter the event code ERForumUBC. That's hashtag ERForumUBC. You can also do it the old-fashioned way and just flag down one of our volunteers in the aisles and write down your question on a cue card, and we will ask them of one of the presenters. And please do address your questions to one of the panelists. We'll have that person address your question, and then we can open it up to further discussion following that. Let's see if we can review the results of our opening poll. The first question was, do you know how you will vote in the upcoming referendum? Yes, I've decided. No, I'm still undecided. I already voted, or I won't be voting. Look at that. Wow, 27%. That's great. Okay, and 4%, I already voted. Oh, pardon me, 69% still undecided. I was looking at the second slide there. Okay, so hopefully this evening will help you out in that. And our second question was also, how are you feeling about the upcoming referendum? Why am I not surprised? Confused, looking at the options, anxious, optimistic. The words proportional and supported are in there as well. So thank you for participating, and we would love to hear your questions as well to the panelists. I would like to start. So what I'll do is I'll go back down and sit down and join our panel members here on the couch. And again, feel free, I'll start things off, but do feel free to join us with your questions as well. My first question is for Sheryl Lightfoot. And you talked about the impact of MMP with Maori representation in New Zealand government. And when you talk about the difference between the Maori Party versus candidates in different parties, how has that translated to the representation of issues and how they are addressed, how Indigenous issues are addressed in government?
Are we just using, okay, thank you. Question
You're welcome.
answered. It's just become a much more complicated game. And again, dynamic over time. So the Maori Party was initially formed out of that single issue, the Foreshore and Seabed Act, which was a huge issue in New Zealand. So just a little bit of background, there was a court case and a tribunal case that ruled that Maori did have existing Aboriginal rights entitled to all of the foreshore and seabed in New Zealand. The Liberal Party, who was ruling at the time, then passed a piece of legislation stripping all of that away by act of parliament. Rather than negotiate or rather than go through any sort of collaborative or negotiated process, they just, by parliamentary fiat, took away all Maori rights to foreshore and seabed. The tremendous political backlash on that one issue. It launched the biggest protest movement in New Zealand that there had been in decades. Outrage, the system almost broke down, truly. And the anger was so great on that issue, and because it was the Labour Party who had passed it, and traditionally there had been a very good relationship between Maori population and the Labour Party, and most Maori MPs at that point were in the Labour Party and not in the other parties. But that soured the relationship to such a great extent that the Maori vote quickly shifted over to the Maori Party on this single issue, but it was such a huge issue that it had that kind of power. But then it put them into alignment with National Party. So now, over the 10 years that they were in coalition with National is a center-right. It's a very pro-resource extraction party. It's a very pro-business party. This didn't sit well with Maori people over time. So it then brought all kinds of other issues into play, social issues, military issues, economic development issues, and then because politics are dynamic, it changed the scope. And so at the last election in 2017, which was almost 10 years after the foreshore and seabed election, as it were, the scope of issues became very broad again and became more focused on local and community issues and social justice issues and so on. So then it spread Maori throughout the different parties, I think, in this last election in a way. But I was there for part of the debate, and the foreshore and seabed issue hadn't gone away. So when Labour was trying to come back into power, that question at every single debate came up. Well, what is your position on foreshore and seabed, and what could we expect to see? So that issue isn't dead yet, but support has shifted back to Labour over time.
Okay, but you've seen the rise of other smaller issues, I guess, also.
There's an array of things on the table now. And that's why Maori reps are spread throughout all of the parties, is different issues are important to different people.
It's really interesting. You have figured out Slido. Good for you. Let's go to our first question here. What, if anything, should we glean from the fact that wealthy and for-profit interests, such as real estate developers, are lining up against PR? So that is a question. It's not addressed to any particular panelist. Max Cameron, perhaps I'll go to you.
Sure, okay. Is my mic working? Is that good? All right.
Yes.
Well, there are a couple of things I'd say about that. One is that if you look at where the money from developers and realtors and big sort of business interests is going, it's going to the no campaign. The money that's going to the yes campaign is typically coming, the small contributions below the sort of the cap, and it's coming from a range of sources. A lot of them unions, environmental groups, and so forth. So the part of the story then, this I think fits with Richard's narrative that this is actually a pretty partisan issue or a left-right kind of issue in the province, which in some sense is sort of unfortunate because the Citizens' Assembly originated out of a concern with the electoral system that was shared by both the Liberals and New Democrats in the past. So part of it's a partisan story. Part of it, I think, is a story that's also kind of connected to, I think, what Richard was saying about how it's more likely that parties of the left will do relatively well in a PR system. And the reason for that is it's hard. If you just sort of think about Ontario, think of if Doug Ford, if there were MMP in Ontario, as was recommended by the Citizens' Assembly there, Doug Ford would not have a majority, and he would be in a position of needing to negotiate with another party, the Liberals or NDP, to form a government there. And if he couldn't do that, then somebody else would form a government. And so there's pressure in the PR system to move toward the center. So you're much less likely to get sort of strong, sort of right-wing governments which have a fairly clear right-wing base. Right-wing parties, when they come to power, typically tend to have to move to the center, but of course, so do left-wing parties to some extent as well. And the final point I would make about this is really a point that has to do with neoliberalism, and that is, it's a lot harder to build things than it is to destroy them. And one of the things that is often part of a neoliberal agenda is to undo government policies and government programs. So for example, building up a capacity to regulate takes many years. It's very easy to fire regulators. Building up a strong, robust, well-integrated welfare state takes decades. It's very easy to dismantle those policies in a short period of time. Getting on track with climate change, getting policies in place that would engineer a shift in our energy systems and moving off of our reliance on fossil fuels. This is being done in countries that have PR because they tend to have governments that build on a consensus around the center or the center left to implement those policies. In a system like ours, what happens is parties come to power, they say, we're going to build fast ferries. The next party comes in and says, we're not going to build fast ferries. We're going to do something else. We're going to privatize CN. And then they proceed with an agenda. They say, we're going to build pipelines. The next government comes in, we're not going to build pipelines. And so we have this problem, really, of difficulty in pursuing policies over the long haul. And I think that that's a problem in particular for parties or governments that seek to carry out an agenda that requires any kind of either redistribution or fundamental shifts in the way in which the society is organized. So I think it's quite natural, in fact, that on balance, the business community and the right and big money doesn't like the idea of PR.
So for people trying to make a decision, just getting back to your point about partisanship, how do they get past that partisanship and make decisions, make choices as to the four options in front of them, just based on their own merits?
Well, I think that, let parties figure out what's in their interests. They will mobilize their voters around the options they think is right for their parties. The campaigns are out there. We've got the yes campaign and the no campaign. Our job as citizens is not to worry about partisanship. It's not to, in fact, I think if you ask most voters, like we could ask how many people here would agree that our politics is already too partisan, right? I think there's a real sense in our public that partisanship has become toxic, that our politics is too adversarial. And so I think those of us who are not necessarily part of a campaign or part of a political party, what we need to be doing is thinking, what kind of politics do we want? And what's the voting system that we can select that is most likely to create the kind of politics that we desire?
Richard Johnston, you want to weigh in?
I think that it's all very well to say you don't like parties. I'd hate to be in a system that did not have them. They are the great simplifier. They make it possible for us to actually understand what the stakes are. Right. It's not to say blank check for everything. The issues, for example, the difficult trade-offs that Grace talks about are terribly important. But at the end of the day, I think it's perfectly reasonable for citizens to ask themselves, what kind of governments would they like to see? Other things equal, governments to the left, governments to the right, governments that are multi-party or governments that are single-party. I think at some level you should actually get down to some of those basics when you're considering what you want to do.
I'd like to, we have two questions here that are along the same vein, and I'd like to put these to you, Richard. The first question is, are the ads that say hate groups will be empowered just scare tactics? And in countries where PR is implemented, have there been cases of fringe parties getting elected?
Of course there's scare tactics. Of course it's also true, however, that fringe parties get elected. So, the fact is, if you have an electoral formula that is accommodating of political tendencies, more than the current one is, you will see parties on the fringes. That's basically true. Now, whether having those parties on the fringes then is a straight line to jackboots, that's another story. And it is true that sort of that part of the scare stories about PR that is not driven by rotating Italian cabinets, which always seem at the end to have the same prime minister, is powered by the Weimar Republic, right? And the collapse of the first German experiment in parliamentary democracy. And it's true, the Weimar Parliament was very fragmented, but I don't think it's the electoral system that created a communist party that was a tool of the Soviet Union and whose job was to undermine the German state. Nor was it the PR system that created millions of angry, disgruntled veterans.
Grace, pardon, go ahead.
if the country is under that kind of stress, we're not talking about electoral systems here. And my last comment is, turn those questions on their head. In 1993, the official opposition in the Canadian Parliament was a party dedicated to the breakup of Canada. Excuse me?
Grace, Laura, I'm wondering what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I had a couple thoughts on the partisan element, just to take it back a second. I'm finding it increasingly disheartening the extent to which it's become partisan, and while in some ways this debate that's planned for next week is already happening, so might as well bring it and have this public conversation between the two leaders in the media. On the other hand, I think it's troubling in that I'm concerned about post-referendum folks who support one party or the other feeling like the decision was not made for them, that we're going to end up with an electoral system decision that some people are viewing as against them, rather than us thinking more broadly about what system we're all going to use. And I worry that the way this conversation is continuing to happen will lend itself to that we're not thinking about how we can do this differently, but it is sort of by being a partisan debate, some people are going to feel like the outcome is intended to disenfranchise them more.
And your thoughts about the kinds of representation that are included in countries where there have been PR?
Yeah, certainly I'm with Professor Johnston here that these are scare tactics. I think we do need to consider the political culture of British Columbia and what is a likely outcome in terms of proliferation of parties. We are likely to have more parties, but they're going to be coming out of a province we already know. Not to say that there are not elements that might be concerning. I think with the thresholds in place of needing to get 5% or likely in many cases more, it's not something I'm concerned about with a move to PR.
Sheryl Lightfoot, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I want to join in on that. And I think the political culture issue is salient because I think if we look at the New Zealand case, have there been, since the move to MMP, quote unquote, fringe parties in Parliament? I think you could argue yes. There have been some of the smaller parties that prior to MMP had zero chance of being elected to Parliament because it was strictly a Labour and National game, and they went back and forth just like we're familiar with. After MMP, the Greens took, and they've always had a reasonable number of seats. So what I'm talking in a small parliament like New Zealand's is 3, 4, 5, 6 seats. We do see New Zealand First come on board where they were not a player prior to MMP, and then other small parties like the ACT. Now, depending on your political orientation, you could call any of those fringe parties, depending on whether you're viewing them for the right or the left. The fact of the matter remains, government in New Zealand is still held by National and Labour. They just have to go into coalition with some of these smaller groups in order to form a government. And from 2008 until the most recent election, that party was the Maori Party. So some people would call that a fringe party, yes. But it created a certain governing consensus, I think, that is quite stable in that context. And so in terms of political culture, I see a lot of similarities to BC.
Okay, Grace, Laura.
Yeah, just a quick point on that. I think some people are concerned, and the sort of fear tactor messaging is that those parties, potential fringe parties with the boot sounds, will hold a balance of power. I think we also have to think that the major parties will have some incentive not to team up with, not join a coalition with fringe parties, with parties that will then, people in general don't support and will then punish them at the polls the next time if they form a coalition with these big teeny but bad parties.
Well, we talk about that collaboration and the need for consensus. Max Cameron, how does that affect the pace at which things get done at government?
That's a really interesting question. I think one of the big concerns that people have is that if you don't have single-party majorities that are more or less clearly established as a result of elections, and parties have to sit down, as we saw in the last election here in BC, it took some time for the Greens to decide whether they were going to support the NDP or the Liberals, and then once they've made a decision to work out a supply and confidence arrangement, which has now been in place for a while, and in fact, that relationship seems to be working pretty well, notwithstanding a lot of the concern that people had that this was a crisis, this was a constitutional crisis for us, and that there was going to be instability in the province of BC. We haven't really seen that. It is true that if you have a highly fragmented party system, so Rich mentioned the Netherlands, right? A classic example of a really pure PR kind of system. Lots of political parties, it can take a long time to form a government. That is a concern. But one of the things that I actually think is important to remember here is the work of putting together an agreement. When parties sit down and negotiate and bargain and try to figure out, okay, where do we have common ground? What's a common program that we can agree on such that we can form a government that commands the confidence of the legislature? That's actually governing. That's part of governing. That's the business of politics. That's what parties are there to do. Because in Canada, we've had a system based on first past the post, which generates false majority governments, we tend to assume that's not actually part of governance, that reflects that's a moment of crisis or uncertainty, or we should be concerned about the fact that it's taking a while for the parties to figure out how they're going to govern. I actually think that this is a desirable feature, not a bug, of a PR system, that it will require the parties to sit down and spend a bit of time working together. And it actually turns out that sometimes the longer they take to work together to come to an agreement, the more solid those agreements are and the better, in fact, they work. So I would urge people not to be too concerned about the possibility that under proportional representation, we're going to see processes of government formation that will be quite different from what we currently experience.
Thank you very much, everyone. Let's move on to the next question here. Will any of the proposed proportional voting systems affect the relative numbers of MLAs from rural versus urban areas? That is a question I hear a lot because I host a province-wide show. Would anyone like to address that?
Well, the claim is that no region in the province will lose members under the system. Undefined what the regions are, and it's undefined what it means to have members. There are, with the possible exception of the far northernmost ridings, there will be bigger ridings, one way or the other. The regions that will not lose representation will have a combination of ridings and list members. So there will be members from the place on the list, but their distribution will be essentially most likely, if some version of the German system is used, Germany being a federation. The makeup of the list component in a region will probably reflect the province-wide popular vote, and a party that doesn't get 5% will be excluded and so on. But depending on how big the group of list MPs, it could be a not terribly proportional result. And if there is a difference between the non-urban and the urban parts of the province in the magnitude of the districts, then that'll actually empower some of the voting groups outside the Lower Mainland, though probably they'd still have less power than they do now.
So how important is that then, Grace Laura, you were talking about the details that are important that we don't know at this point. Some of them will be determined afterwards. So how relevant is that question to what we don't know, the details that we don't know as of yet?
Mm-hmm. So I think the details that remain to be sorted are important, and they are consequential to a number of the things that we want out of our electoral system. Some people have stated that it's too bad that we're having a vote before we know all the details. At the same time, I think we can think about which of these systems we think is going to work for us individually as voters and continue the engagement process after the fact. Continue telling our MLAs what we would prefer on these, on the questions. And even the word detail seems a bit wrong to me. In some of the ways we're talking about how many people will represent you, that seems more than a detail to me. It seems, in fact, determines your relationship with the people who are doing the governing on your behalf. Same with whether you're voting for a party list or an individual candidate under MMP. These are how we're going to interact with our ballot. So I don't think it means that we shouldn't be voting on these questions or that we shouldn't choose which system we like. I think it requires us to continue our engagement after the fact.
Okay. Thank you very much for all your questions. I see lots of them coming in, so I'll try to get to as many of them as I can we have about half an hour left here. So I know I'm asking a lot of follow-up questions, so I'll try to rein myself in here. Let's move on to the next question now. How would the PR system affect the ethnic representation? Is it more encouraging for people from minority groups to participate in politics, or discouraging? Yes, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a couple of thoughts on these. So thinking about ethnic diversity representation in politics has very different dynamics than thinking about gender diversity, because women are not concentrated in any electoral district or group, right? By definition, women are all over the place. But particularly in parts of the Lower Mainland, there are electoral districts that are majority minority. And as such, first past the post can actually be quite good in ensuring representation of ethnic minorities and encouraging diversity on that front. So there is an element of first past the post that supports that sort of diversity and representation. That will continue under mixed member proportional, or the systems in which there's still a tight geographic tie, even if those ridings are bigger, right? So I think we're still going to retain some of that. I'd also like to speak to that question by referencing opportunities for representation after the fact. So under dual member proportional, you will have 2 MLAs. Under rural urban, you may have between 2 and up to 7. So there might actually be opportunities after the election for you to choose who to go talk to about certain issues. And this might be relevant on issues that we think are related to gender or may have a cultural or ethnic component to it, and there might be increased opportunities to talk to somebody you think may have had a shared experience with you. And so that might be the benefit of multiple representatives per riding. So we can answer that question both in terms of elections and the voting, but I believe the question was also participating in politics. Is it encouraging or discouraging? So we might want to think about having choices of who to go to in terms of bringing your issues forward to government after an election.
Okay. Would anyone else like to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll just say that in terms of looking at ethnic diversity or representation, I think we can draw some lessons from the Maori experience, because the Maori patterns of voting in New Zealand are essentially as a very large minority group, because there's nothing, when you're talking about Maori participation in electoral politics, there's nothing specifically Indigenous about that. There are different ways that the Maori relate to the Crown in different contexts, but when they're shifting to vote in electoral systems, they are acting as one great big 15% ethnic minority in a sense. Although I should step back from that a bit, because there are treaty implications and so on, but it's just a landscape that acts more like other ethnic groups. And there are plenty of ethnic diversity groups in New Zealand that are quite well represented under the system as well. And although I don't know those specifics as intimately as I know the Maori ones, I think we have seen both a broadening and an expanding of ethnic diversity within the parties, similar to the Maori experience. What we haven't seen in New Zealand is any other ethnic minority party come into play. Maori has been the only one, and it was at that particular time and for that particular set of issues, and then we saw it go away when that came off of the political landscape. So there is this illustrative point. So if there is a particular hot issue for ethnic minorities or racialized groups, there is an opportunity space to then mobilize in the form of a party and then extract some additional needs out of the parties who want to govern with you. So what it did for Maori Party in the short term was to get National to play better by Maori terms. So by taking the time to go through that agreements that Max was talking about, to get these extensive concessions from National, the Maori had a much better deal under a national government in that scenario than they would have had without their party. So there are ways to think creatively about it.
Okay, thank you very much. This next question is, pardon me? Yes, I'm hoping someone can bring the paper questions up. Okay, perfect, great. Okay, so we are able to include them then. Okay, great. I hope we get to your question. Sean is asking, it's hard enough for independents to get elected under the current system. Will any of the three options make it easier for independents? Who would like to take that on?
Well, rural, urban, possibly, at least for urban places, because the system there is the single transferable vote, where the vote is actually for candidates. Well, candidates have party labels, obviously, but it is a system where sort of entitlement to a seat is predicated on votes accruing to a candidate. And so if there's an independent who can have some kind of constituency in this larger riding, I'm not sure on what basis, but if there is such a person, that person has a shot at getting a seat in as much as people are voting for candidates. There are, the dual member system actually cuts a slightly more favorable deal for independents than it does for representative parties. And in fact, there's even some concern that perhaps parties will dissolve themselves as parties, or at least some interests that might be thought of as a party will present themselves as an aggregate of independents, and then you'll discover after the fact that actually they're a political affinity who gamed the system. That's a possibility.
Max Cameron, did you want to weigh in?
Well, I guess I agree with Dick, and I would say that part of what's behind this is a bit of a question about the importance of power parties. That's something a lot of people are concerned about, and there is an argument that's sort of out there that says under PR you won't get to choose who your MLA is. That will be chosen for you by a political party, and that's really not true. But I think that one of the important distinctions that's been made in this panel is between open and closed lists. That if you have an open list under MMP for the regional MLAs, voters can opt for specific candidates within that list. That empowers voters relative to the party. It allows them to upturn the party's ranking of candidates. Similarly, with single transferable vote, voters are able to select the candidates that they most prefer and split their ticket. So you could vote, you can rank your ballot and say, I'm number one for candidate for party A, and my second choice will be for a candidate for a different political party. That's one of the reasons why political parties actually are not thrilled with that particular system, tend to resist it.
Does it affect, though, when you're looking at the second MLAs, for example, dual member, or the regional MLAs that would come from party lists, and if they're chosen by the party, does that affect the person's ability to vote for an individual?
Well, so if it's a closed list, then you get to vote for your district MLA, and then you vote for the party list, right?
I mean, in the dual member, it is a closed list system. Let's be clear about that. I mean, you can, as you can now, vote on the basis of the characteristics of an individual, but remember that whatever vote you cast will be counted towards the party's province-wide total. So you could be acting against a larger interest that you hold by voting for that individual.
And the current system is also a
Absolutely
closed list
right.
system, right?
That's absolutely right.
Okay. I hope that answers the question, Sean. Thank you very much for that. And another question now, do you see any of the, pardon me, we have, there it is. Thank you very much. Do you see any of these PR systems resulting in higher voting rates? Who would like to address that? We talked about it a little bit. I think, Richard, you touched on that, and the guilt that brings you to the polls.
Well, that's sort of the big question. I'm not aware of a definitive study of existing systems that actually gets to the mechanism that produces the undoubted difference, right? Whether there's something about PR as such that will encourage greater voter turnout. I mean, it is true, however, that the likelihood that you would be discouraged by the infeasibility of the alternative you prefer won't necessarily be always never zero, but it is likely, you are more likely to see some sort of connection between your choice and the overall outcome, even if that doesn't thread through the particular MP that you represent. You know, if you're in any of these systems, with some modification from system to system, the party vote that you cast will go towards the party's share of seats. And that will be true wherever you live.
Yes, Max Cameron.
Well, just to add, it did not happen in New Zealand, right? So people suspected that maybe in New Zealand, after MMP was adopted, turnout would grow. However, it's important to remember the turnout is already very high in New Zealand, much higher than it is here in Canada or BC. So it is still entirely possible that it could go up. But again, it's a reminder that these things are not, you can't predict these things in a mechanical way. Anything that is affected by the electoral system, like number of parties or turnout, is going to be affected by a variety of other things as well.
Do you see any impact, Sheryl Lightfoot,
No,
here?
it's dynamic, and that is one qualitative difference between New Zealand and the Canadian context that in my longer version of the talk I would go into. But yeah, the voter turnout is high, and that's just a fact of political culture. And because these things are dynamic, we could see a shift or we could retain exactly what we see. I mean, the truth of the matter is the political landscape in New Zealand hasn't changed that dramatically since MMP came in. It's pretty much recognizable one way or the other. Again, National carries it or Labour carries it, and they tend to run in two-cycle elections, quite similar to what we've had. It wasn't a seismic shift in a lot of ways. For Maori, it did increase their representation, and it's created a slight shift in political culture to be more representative across the board. But again, these things are not earth-shattering.
Thank you for that question. I'd like to hopefully get to some of the cue card questions as well. So I hope we can sort of distinguish between them or mark them in some way so we can make sure that we do address the questions that are being written down here in the audience. Let's see here. RG is asking, pardon me. There's a cue card. Oh, look at all those questions. Great. Okay, the first one is, I like MMP, but details are missing on how candidates are assigned seats. How do we regulate who goes to which district? Can this be defined before the referendum? Who would like to take that?
Well, it's been ruled off the agenda. It's one of the details to be worked out later.
Yeah. So there's the answer to that. That is one of the details that will be decided after. The second cue card question is, do you think the referendum is structured well? Seems it would have been better that voters rank question 2, but let our elected members decide on final format. And Max is wanting to answer that one.
No, I don't think so. I think that the ballot that we have, which is much like the New Zealand one from '96, is correctly constructed, because it asks the question of principle first. And I think it's critical that if anything come out of this process, there be a clear mandate. So asking, do you want to retain first past the post or move to a PR system? That's the vital question. You could have had a system where you ranked 4 options, including first past the post, and have a runoff against each of those options. But I think that would have actually confused the result and made it harder for us to discern. I think there's a direct question here. Do we want a PR system or not? I think that question should be asked directly. It was done for a variety of reasons. It was done because one of the things that the Attorney General found in the survey and consultation that they did was that people wanted the option of ranking different systems. It was so I think that it's consistent with voter preferences. Now, it is true that one of the things that happened in New Zealand was after ranking preferences across electoral systems, there was a second referendum in which there was a choice between the status quo and the system that was proposed. And we don't have that here, and I think that's part of partly because of the time pressures that we're under to get this through if it's going to happen under a single parliament. But I think it's also important to remember there's a second referendum which is planned if there is a shift toward PR. So after 2 electoral cycles, people would have a chance to decide whether they were happy with the system. I noticed one of the questions was, have system have voters opted to go back from PR to first past the post. There have been a number of referenda held, for example, in Ireland to see whether people wanted to leave STV and move to first past the post, and it was turned down. There have been subsequent referenda in New Zealand. They opted to continue their system. Scotland has MMP. It's opted to continue under its system. I think France was the only system.
Can I just say, I don't like the system. I really don't think they've gone about it the right way, but it's
The referendum,
it's
you mean.
flogging a dead horse. Here's where we are. What I urge voters not to do is to throw up their hands on the general question because of the obfuscation around the ranked ballots. Okay, that would be my first point. And then the second is Grace's point. It ain't over till it's over. And if there is a move towards PR, there will be an implementation process. And for certain things, the devil is in the details. And that's where the next battle is to be fought if it happens.
There is a question here as well. Is a referendum the most appropriate tool available to make this decision?
I don't think we have any choice on that matter. We've essentially established it as a precedent. I don't think the experience of the first referendum, 2005, was negative at all. Things have kind of gone sideways since.
I'll go to Sheryl and then Max on that.
Okay, I'm going to weigh in from an Indigenous perspective here in British Columbia and say that I'm not at all comfortable with the way that this is moving forward and the pace at which it's moving forward. And one of the things that I am most worried about is that there hasn't been sufficient opportunity for Indigenous consultation. And by that I mean with the chiefs and with the organizations, and they haven't had a chance to really weigh this in terms of underlying and Aboriginal rights and title and what the impacts of that might be on different forms of relationship in British Columbia. If you go back to my original slide, we have an array of different treaty relationships here and very certainty around underlying rights and title. And so how to participate in ways that would encourage Indigenous people to vote in a system when those issues are still on the table and up for negotiation and undetermined is a question I wish that Indigenous leadership just had more time to sit with and get informed about and make critical decisions about. So if I had my choice, I would pull back and do an extended consultation with Indigenous political actors.
Okay, and Max Cameron?
I would agree with that, and I would say that in general, it would have been nice to have had a much more fulsome process of public engagement. I don't know whether we could have done a citizens' assembly again, maybe that would not be necessary, but at least something like a deliberative poll or citizens' juries. But take the time to bring the public up to speed, because I do sense that there is confusion in the minds of many voters about what these different systems are. That said, I don't agree with the narrative, which is in the papers, about how the system, the deck is stacked, it's a rigged system, that in fact what's going on here is that the NDP and the Greens are trying to game the system for their own advantage. I think if you actually look at how this process was undertaken, it's really quite different from that. There was an initial, I don't consider a sufficiently robust process of consultation, but there was a process of consultation involving both a survey, a poll, a survey that you could fill out, but also soliciting of recommendations from interested groups that was taken by the Attorney General, who was recused from Cabinet, was asked to step aside from his Cabinet role, not participate in Cabinet debates on this, and manage this process. And it was the Attorney General's office that then reviewed the submissions that they received, and you can see, if you look at the submissions, you look at the ballot, that the thinking shifted. So in the initial survey that they sent out to voters, list PR was on the system, for example, the most common type of PR in Europe. That's dropped. What the Attorney General did was take the recommendations that were received and to come up with a ballot that reflected that, and that's why we have these three options on the table. And you could say to yourself, well, why do we have untested options on the ballot? Why don't we just have simple systems like some of the European ones, like list PR? And the reason for that is because the Attorney General, for better or for worse, took seriously the consultations that were undertaken, and those were the options that people put on the table. So if you consult with advocates who support PR, the kind of things that there are very few of them who advocate for list PR for a whole host of reasons, mostly having to do with what I was saying before about how the systems that we have are compromises that retain local representation. So rural-urban is an idea that comes out of a debate inside Canada about how do we keep local representation, but at the same time create greater proportionality. Dual-member proportional is an idea that is actually the brainchild of a graduate student at the University of Alberta who recently invented it. It was put on the ballot in PEI. It's true it's never been tested anywhere, but it's an absolutely brilliant and ingenious idea, and there's a lot of enthusiasm for it in the circles that support PR. And it was really the Attorney General's attempt to construct a ballot that reflected what his office heard that has got us where we are. Now you could say it's too complex and it's too rushed and so forth, and I tend to agree with that. But I don't think it's necessarily because this is a sort of rigged system.
Okay. This next question follows up a little bit on that, and I'll pose this to you, Grace Lohr. We have a cue card question. DMP results are proportional, MMP results are largely proportional, RUP results are likely proportional. Why is the probability of achieving proportionality different among the systems?
It's different because proportionality is not the only thing we care about. If all we wanted was a proportional system, as has been said, we would just have British Columbia and 87 MLAs. But these systems have chosen different ways to go about retaining some of the things we care about under first past the post while achieving proportionality. So I think part of the reason with rural-urban is this sort of mix of systems, right, of the STV and then the MMP. So making sure that that overlaps in the aggregate in a way that's fully proportional, I think remains to be seen. But it remains to be seen because it's also trying to achieve some of the other goals. And then the MMP, largely proportional, again, that will depend on how many MLAs are elected from first past the post and how many are elected in regions and how big those regions are. So all of these systems move very significantly towards outcomes that are more reflective of votes and seats, where seats are more reflective of votes, but they do so trying to achieve other objectives, and so it's not a perfect match.
Okay, let's try to get through a couple more here before the end of our evening. Two questions, a two-parter. How would PR work at the municipal level? Would it increase women's chances of election? Would you like to address that? That's your area of study as well, women's participation.
Sure, so I think we should be very clear that this referendum won't affect municipal voting. But
the mayor-elect of Vancouver is thinking that that would be something that he would like to pursue.
So Vancouver will be a little bit unique because of the importance of civic parties and municipal parties in Vancouver. That would change the ballot and how people vote there. In other municipalities across the province where parties are much less of a factor, it doesn't quite make sense. What impact it would have on the number of women elected is again dependent on exactly how that would look. We did see in some municipalities in this last election quite a significant number of women elected, in other jurisdictions not so much. So I think part of the question on the municipal level is how to facilitate women's representation in the absence of parties as much as a question of whether a proportional system would do that in Vancouver, for example.
Okay. And another question here addressed to Max. How and when will the implementation of PR systems be decided? Do you believe finding people is a good way to encourage voting?
This is, I must have somehow stacked this. I mean, there's a group of people in this audience who participated in the Summer Institute for Future Legislators, where we train people for politics, and the idea is to recruit good people into politics. I see a number of faces here that are very familiar, and I suspect one of them asked that question. So let me just say, I love political parties. I think they're really important. Partisanship is a central part of our politics, but it's also, in my view, the case that partisanship can be excessive. And so one of the things that we do in the Summer Institute is we encourage people to learn to come into an environment in which they have to work across partisan lines. So we encourage cross-partisanship. But a fascinating thing, let me just give you a sort of quick anecdote from some of the participants who are in that program will know what I was talking about. As soon as you invite people, as we do, to form a party, to choose a leader, and to take a label, they immediately become tribal. And so we do this. We organize people into parties, and then we put them into question period. And what happens? They wind up bashing each other and attacking each other. And they replicate exactly the behavior that we see in politics all the time. And then we encourage people to stand back and reflect on what they're doing and thinking about how can we do politics differently. But one of the things that's really interesting is under our current system, the way it works, if you ask yourself the question, why is it that parliamentarians are so adversarial? Why do they attack each other in the legislature? Why is question period such a brawl? If you are in opposition and you know that your voice counts for almost nothing, it is highly gratifying to attack the government and to tear them down at every chance you can possibly get. And if you're in government, it's kind of fun to go in there and just sort of dismiss the opposition and laugh at them and ignore their questions and not answer them, as we see all the time. So our system actually creates a kind of partisanship in the legislature, turns the legislature into an arena of partisan competition. One of the things that it's possible that PR could do is by getting us away from single-party majority governments where the opposition is essentially irrelevant for the 4 years that that party's in power, is we would create a parliament where, in fact, politicians, in order to form government and to get things done, actually have to work together. And I think that that could create a culture. It would take time, but it could create a bit of a culture of cooperation and collaboration. And certainly it seems that that's what we've seen in New Zealand. We had Helen Clark here recently who sort of made exactly this claim, that once PR was introduced, parliamentarians figured pretty quickly that in order to get things done, they had to work together. To me, that is one of the primary advantages of a PR system.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that is all the time we have for questions. The time has come to wrap up our conversation. My thanks to Grace Lohr, Sheryl Lightfoot, Richard Johnston, Max Cameron for being such fantastic panelists. Thank you to you for being so engaged and putting forward such fantastic questions. I hope you're feeling a little bit more confident as you make your decision in this continuing referendum and the issues to consider. And thanks as well to the event staff here at UBC Robson Square, our student volunteers from UBC Political Science for their help in making everything run smoothly, and to the UBC Community Engagement Office for organizing tonight's forum.
Thank you.
And final details, just so you have these reminders, a referendum is being held by mail between now and November 30th. You can look for the voting package in your mailbox. And if you haven't received one yet, you should be receiving it by November 2nd. You can contact Elections BC by November 23rd to request one. And do go to the Elections BC website for some helpful resources as well. Thank you again for coming tonight. I'm Michelle Eliot. Have a great evening. Safe travels home.